I've never in my life felt like being at the grocery store was an anxiety-producing experience. And every time I go, when I get to my car, I'm like, well, that was intense. Business is messy and unpredictable.
Sometimes lonely.
So lonely.
So lonely.
And inspiration can often come from really weird places.
We pick up where the bullet point blogs and the highlight reels leave off.
We start with the stories.
So here's my story. We live in a fairly large neighborhood south of York, Pennsylvania. And like everybody, I think, in the country, people are just itching to get away from just the little local carryouts and the home-cooked meals, even if they get something in like Blue Apron, just itching to get out. And so what some incredibly entrepreneurial and wonderful soul did in the neighborhood is they started arranging a regular schedule of food trucks from different restaurants that would come to the neighborhood. And the food trucks, you can see who does this well and who doesn't do it well, which restaurants. But one of the guys that was really doing it well has a restaurant that's a Greek restaurant and has some American, like a Greek and American grill type restaurant. Never did carry out, never did delivery before, but they have this food truck. And I was talking to them when I got up to the window, and I said, you've got a line here that's really going well. Is this new for you? Because I've never even seen you at a festival with a food truck. And he said, not only is this new for us, but we've had these conversations about just making this our business. And we have this, he said, I don't know why he started talking to me like this was some sort of consultation, but I guess he wanted to talk about it. So he was saying that I have partners that are like, can't wait to reopen the restaurant, can't wait to reopen the restaurant. But I've been thinking, he said, look at this line. He says, I've been thinking, well, wait a minute.
Yeah.
We're actually doing pretty well. And if we took the money that it would take to run the whole restaurant, and obviously there are complications with rent and stuff like that, but if we took the money that we would normally use to run our business pre-pandemic and put it into 3 or 4 of these food trucks, it's lower expense, higher profit, easier to shift, more nimble menu. He said, so I'm just not sure. And so what that made me think of, and the reason that I brought this up is because, at the time we're recording this, it's a lot of states are talking about reopening. And so I've had a lot of conversations with clients about what reopening looks like for them.
Yeah, me too. It is the topic of the week.
It's the topic of the week. And certainly internally, we have a small firm where the nature of the business that we're in lends itself to being remote. We don't have a walk-in clientele, and although we do have some clients that come in for meetings, a lot of that can be done on Zoom or regular phone calls or even over email. And so all I know about going in, when I look at staging when we go in, there's no way that we're going to go in and have our people wear masks in the office. Right? It's just uncomfortable.
Not now anyway. Like certainly not. I mean, at some point, but anyway, keep going.
But that's not how we would work. Well, but at the same time, we can't go in our business. We can't go in social distance because when we work collaboratively, we're looking over contracts. We're on conference calls. We're sitting even across conference tables. They're not 6 feet apart.
Right.
So,
and my brain immediately went to, well, you could, like right now you're looking at the contracts online, so you could each be in your offices. And I'm like, and looking at it online, I'm like, right, but if you're going to do that.
But if we're going to do that, that's exactly the point.
Why go in?
So anyway, so what it got me thinking of with the food truck, what it got me thinking of is for each business, you have to decide what does going in look like.
Yeah. So this is the thing that I have talked about all week, and it's been so interesting because a couple things. One, everyone's looking to other companies and industries and Googling things for advice on back, which is super important. I mean, there's no sense recreating the wheel. There's certain thought processes that genuinely do apply to everyone. Like one topic in that category that I've thought is very interesting is some clients who are thinking through how they, or wanted to think through how they feel about employees who have a spouse that's particularly high risk, like a nurse or a doctor who works in a hospital. They're like, do we feel differently about that person being in the office than other people? And those are some things I think it's great to reach out and say, how are people thinking this through? What does that look like? But from the return to efficiency working in the office thing, I've been fascinated to watch and experience, because a lot of these conversations started with some version of, and this took a lot of different textures and rhythms and flavors, some version of, we're going to have a staggered return. Some people thought, well, right, like very few people were coming at it from a, on May whatever,
right.
All show up and be working 100%.
Yes. Somebody fires a starting pistol and we all go.
And we all go. No, I can't think of a single, I can't think of a single conversation where that was on the table. There are a bunch of versions of, maybe we'll start off with 4 people back, and then it'll be 8, and then it'll be 10, and we'll figure out what we need to figure out as we go, or whatever. But there were also several people who were imagining that they would start off with almost a halftime version of coming back, where like these people come on Tuesdays and Thursdays and these other people come on Mondays and Wednesdays, and then like every other Friday. It's sort of like shared custody of the office. You split your time.
I have a number of questions on that.
You're making a like crumbly.
Well, I have a number of questions on that. I didn't want to interrupt your flow, but I'm just wondering, well, do you choose by department, or do you figure that Mike and Lisa work well together and they go in at the same time?
Well, like I said, there were a million different ways that got sliced. Like one way was half of marketing. You take any department and just half it. So because sometimes the thinking was just have fewer people in the office so they can stay distanced.
I get that, but that sounds awful. But anyway.
I know. Well, so this is kind of to my point though. So, and I it's not like, I'm not going to pretend that I didn't go into some of these conversations right on board with thinking through a staggered strategy.
Sure. No, I understand. You have to consider that.
Yeah, you have to start there. But super quickly, it just became glaringly apparent to me that it's completely the wrong way to be thinking about it. And then what really became clear to me is every company is different, because, I mean, we'll just be silly about it. A restaurant can't have can't have a third of their people come back. Well, I guess in theory they could, but, you're not going to.
Well, a lot of my contractors, a lot of my construction companies,
right,
couldn't have a third of the people. They can't do a third of the dry. They just got to do the drywall.
You got to do the drywall or not do the drywall. Exactly. Yeah. And so there are some industries that answer those questions for you. Like, just like that's not possible in our industry or whatever. Then within any given industry, you have to think through the different departments and things and people, because what I noticed was, a lot of people have just in the past week or so hit their stride of, they have their home office set up, they've figured out the technology, they've got some workflows, a little bit of routine. They're finally sort of feel like they're getting in a work day. In fact, too much of a work day, but that's been our past couple episodes, so I won't go down that rabbit hole. To suddenly say like, oh, now 2 days a week I'm going to be in the office or something.
Yeah.
Really just started to get, and so here's where I ended up with it. I think it's the wrong question, and it's wrong to come at this with the assumption, unless you prove that this is the case, that a tiny bit of being back is a move in the right direction. Because you have to come, I've been thinking of it coming from the other end. So until such time, and it's really funny because I have to add this caveat, because otherwise people are like, are you suggesting we never come back? I'm like, no. Unless maybe, but we'll pause here. Until such time as it is possible for us to all be back functioning more closely to the way we always did, because like even team meetings and conference rooms are going to be tricky and sometimes impossible. If you need to have 14 people in the room and you have 14 chairs, that's going to be really tricky and nerve-wracking for some people, and therefore degrade the quality of the meeting if somebody's constantly thinking about, oh my God, she's so close to me. Like, did she just sniff?
Well, or the fact that, oh, his wife is an ER doc.
Exactly. So until such time as we can be back in some sort of normalcy or closer to it, whatever that means for you, is like thinking about what's not working, what's not in this current state of everybody being separate and virtual, which parts are really not working well? I keep bringing this up, but like my husband's architecture firm, for the most part, is doing great, and it's just fine. And the collaborative tools are working great. Really struggling with like collaborative design because it's hard online, and so that doesn't mean that would be a thing that there are other problems there because they would have to all be around a table or something, and that more questions. But it doesn't change the it doesn't change the fact that if you start from that end, and maybe it makes more sense for some people to just stay at home full time until such time as you can all come back. So I'm just really questioning the staggered start.
Well, I like framing it in terms of which parts of the remote workplace or the remote experience are not working for you.
Right.
Because then you start to figure out, okay, well, what's the solution?
It's like being clear on what problem we're solving.
Yes, but the two challenges are these. Number one, you're not free. Most businesses are not free to solve the problem in any way that makes sense. So, for example, I've got a lease, and my lease runs through, I think, 2022.
Right.
Okay. So I can't decide that I'm going to solve the problem by reshaping and not having as much space and having this or whatever, because I've got a fixed quote unquote solution that I have to kind of put my thinking into. Right. I suppose I could go out and do so, or I could leave it vacant, but it's a drain and it's a significant drain. So that's the first thing. The second thing is when I look at my own situation, what's not working for me isn't necessarily the substantive work.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of the secret sauce. It's the things that make my day better, that make my work a little bit better. It's the collaborative time. It's the non-scheduled time. Sometimes, and you and I do this all the time, sometimes we have conversations that are just kind of catch up or whatever. But a lot of times those conversations, which are not on a particular subject, they're like, oh, you know what? That reminds me. And it helps us individually in our whatever we're doing. It leads to a podcast episode. So it's hard to say, so here's how we're going to stagger coming back. Between 10 and 12, we're going to have unscheduled conversations because that's what's not working for me.
Right. We're going to meet in the office one day a week so that we can have impromptu.
Right. So that we can sit around, and maybe that, as I'm thinking about it, we're kind of laughing about it. Maybe there would be some tonic for my office to say, okay, you know what? And we're going to start with coffee in the office 2 days a week from 8 to 9, and we're doing 8 to 10, whatever it is. And that's it. And then you can go home if you want or whatever. But everything else, I mean, we can work remotely. When Kim wants to talk to me about a contract and she puts it up on the screen and we go through it together, it's not as easy as it is if we were in person, but
if you were in person at the moment, see, this is where I segment it. I am not, so this comes back to your lease thing. I am not, unlike your story with the truck who's like vaguely considering, should I just never have version of an office again?
Right.
I will say that has some other issues. Like, would people be lined up in normal times? Like, I don't know. That you have to think it through. Like, yes, people are lining up. I don't know if they would be lining up if there wasn't this hunger for, whatever. But that's a different episode. The part of this thinking that feels really valuable to me right now isn't about, do we just never have an office again? In fact, I think that's the risk that I'm seeing is, that seems like the alternative, and people don't want to think that or can't because they have a lease. And so they go back to, well, it has to look like some amount of coming back. I look at it like until you can come back, because like with the contracts, you could go back into the office, but that's not going to make reviewing contracts any easier because you'd have to figure out some way to be like separate enough.
Right.
Like you can't be sitting side by side, shoulder to shoulder, looking at the same piece of paper, going over a thing. That's not going to help. So that's the question. Wow. I think I had a lot of coffee this morning. The question is, Two, if I do have this person come back a little bit, or these few people a little bit, what very specifically is the value of that? What am I gaining by having some people come back? Because if you really ask that question, sometimes the only answer is, well, it just feels like we're coming back.
Right. It feels
Yeah. And I
it
don't,
feels more normal. But the other thing is
right.
the other thing to me has to do with individual agency. Because
Um,
I mentioned, when you were talking about your 14-person conference with 14 chairs in the conference room, what is the level of each person's authority to say, you know what, I don't feel I love Mike, but his wife is an ER doc.
we're gonna all have to take a crash. Well, one of two things is going to happen, and I'm fearful it will look far more like the latter than the former. The good, healthy version of this is we all have to take a crash course in healthy boundaries, not literal boundaries, although also literal boundaries, but saying, the ability to say, I'm not comfortable with this, and to hear, I'm not comfortable with this. To somebody say, I'm sorry, but you like are a little closer than I am comfortable with. And it may be that this won't be around who's right or wrong. Like maybe I am 6 feet, but for that person, it just doesn't feel like it feels a little closer for some reason. Like one version is we all get a little bit better about having those conversations. The other version is that everyone keeps doing it the way a lot of people already do it, which then looks like a lot more passive aggressive resentments and snarky comments and backhanded side winding rounds and rounds and triangulating. I can't believe Kevin stands so close to everyone, to other people. It will show up somewhere, and that's concerning. But
No, and
but
I've gotten the other part of it is I've gotten a number of calls from the business owner saying, well, what is our liability here?
yes, that
So
has been some concern too.
if we're bringing people in and I say, okay, you have to come in now,
Mm-hmm.
because there's an assumption for most business owners, and I don't say that pejoratively. I mean, with good reason, there's an assumption that at some point we're going to have to say people are coming back into the office. And further, we're not, I've heard this from a number of people. I don't know when that is, but we're not staying out all of 2020. If things are like they are right now, or they get better from here, we can't just decide this year is a wash and we're not occupying our space. But if we say, okay, guys, now you have to come in, just kind of like after a big snow, stay home if you can't get in safely. But at some point when the plows have been out for a little while, you say, look, I get that it's not ideal conditions, but you still have to come in now.
I think so, but I think there's a lot of value to the thought exercise of starting from that other end. So if we knew that just to surface the things that you will most have to address. So if we knew that if somebody said you're going to have to stay exactly like this until the end of 2020, what are the issues? And for better or for worse, it can't be like, well, I still have to pay rent on the other thing, because that's a given. That variable doesn't.
Correct.
You don't decide to come back because you're paying rent. I mean, you can, but it's because it feels better to feel like you're using the space. But regardless, that sits there.
Right. You can't, because that's akin to saying we can't abandon the strategy because we've already spent so much getting here.
Right.
Right.
which we all do that, but
at the same time,
yeah.
it can't become.
Because it's that realization, if you are going to do it, to be like, well, I'm going to do it, but I have to, I want people to just be honest about why they're doing it. Like, you can still choose to do it, but it reminds me of, the first time we were looking at potentially buying a house, we went and met with this friend of ours who does mortgages. And he had us write up like a basic budget kind of thing to really look into like how much we could afford in a mortgage before we went about the process of applying it. And he was talking about our financial goals. And I said, I really want to pay off my student loans. And he was like, oh, okay, what, why? And I said, well, that would be $350 extra of cash flow that we could put towards, towards our mortgage. And he said, okay, so you want to pay off $60,000 of loans so you can get $350 in cash flow. So why aren't you considering paying the $12,000 left on your car so you can get $400 in cash flow? And I was like, oh, I don't know. He goes, I know why. And I was like, why? And he's like, because people just hate having student loans. It feels better to be not have your student loan. He said, which
Yep.
means you can choose that if you want, but I just don't want you assigning that value because you think it's for cash flow. He's like, there's a better option if cash flow is really what you're after. And I'm
Right.
like, huh, that is it. And I did have this weird resistance of paying off the car loan. I'm like, well, that's a lot of money to dump into just like, I was like, oh, isn't that interesting? So the process of separating the variables so you know what you're choosing, you can still make that choice, but be clear that you're having people go back a little bit just so, in some cases, just so it feels like you're coming back. But it might actually be at like a detriment to productivity and flow and consciousness. But
No, and the cash flow is a really good way of framing it to me, because if you look at it from a metrics point of view, what do you count as success? In
right,
that instance, what you were saying would be the metric, the hallmark of a successful strategy was the maximum cash flow gained from your technique, from whatever tactic you choose to
right.
adopt. And so what this reminds me of is maybe where the conversation really starts, and it could even get down to granular to an individual and employee level or department or whatever, is for businesses to really hone in on the metrics for success.
Right.
How do they know if these people are being successful in their work environment, in their position, regardless of where that environment is? So, for example, now we don't, as you know, we've discussed, our firm doesn't live and die by the billable hour, but let's assume for the sake of discussion that we were a 100% billable hour firm.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And if if what I was looking at were two metrics, one was three metrics. I would look at business development. Do we have clients still coming in?
Mm-hmm.
I would look at certainly client satisfaction. Are we serving them well to the best of our ability and meeting their needs, et cetera? And then the third criteria I would be looking at is obviously, are we meeting our billable hour target, so
Right.
that our revenue, so that we're able to pay our expenses and make a profit and whatever, give Christmas bonuses or whatever we want to do. If all of those things were being met in spades, we were just doing it really well, we were hitting all of those metrics, honestly, I'd still think, when are we going back? Because I'd want this desire for normality, the
Right.
pre-pandemic normality.
Well, and to your previous point, there is value that is being, it doesn't hit those three metrics, but there's like an unnamed loss of what might have burbled up if you had
There is,
those
there is,
interstitial times. It's
but
like
at
a
the same
harder than to.
time, I'd have to be honest with myself that, all right, we're hitting these metrics, so maybe, when we're coming back doesn't have to be the burning question on my mind, because we're hitting all of our metrics,
Yeah. It really is the question. And it's why you really have to take every company and then think about every job role. I mean, because that those questions you're just asking are wildly different for the accounting department versus the sales department versus the
Yeah.
analysts versus like whatever. They all have different issues. One thing that's come up is like monitors. If somebody's used to having like a 3 or 4 monitor setup, and for whatever reason they're not taking the, or somebody has to make tons of copies, not
Yeah.
like I can print this out on my inkjet printer kind of level. If it's that kind of task, there's some very real problems but that's the thing, like those are the things that aren't working. So how do we get those people back in or whatever? But there's another level to it that is truly a complete unknown. I mean, I want to be super clear. All these conversations, I don't feel like I have the answers for a lot of these things. I do feel like we're surfacing a lot of the really important questions that are going to have to be figured out, because what we have never seen or experienced or have data for in advance is the very real psychological impact when people are trying to come back. So I joked about it, like if Kevin's sitting too close, or if, so and so's wife or husband is an ER person or whatever. I saw one company send out, and I saved it, and I think it's really valuable, a survey on how people feel about coming back. So when it's time to come back, is it your desire? And they used the word desire, which I think was very well chosen, because they're not saying what do you want? As if, and then I'll place your order and deliver your want to you. But what is your desire? To stay home exactly like you are right now, to be back a little bit, to be back full time when that's an option? There were a couple other questions that just got into the because here's the thing. Let's say 50% of your staff is doing is work, has met those metrics, like the work is functioning well and they're feeling pretty fine. They'd love to come back, but they're going to feel super, super nervous about it. And if not even sort of pressured, if that is so they given their own choices, they would stay home and they don't really want to come, but they feel like they need to because the office has decided they're back open again. If those people, I'm just imagining those people sitting at their desks working with this low hum of anxiety and tension. I mean, think about how it feels to go to the grocery store. I've never in my life felt like being at the grocery store was an anxiety producing experience. And every time I go, when I get to my car, I'm like, well, that was intense.
Yeah, but the other part of it, what about the 50% or 20% or whatever of your workforce that might be in a one-bedroom apartment with two-year-old children, and they're like, I can't wait to get back. So you've got different needs. So that's number one, a need to get back. Number two, what occurred to me is also the question you asked with the food truck, which is, hey, if they made a decision that food truck is the way to go, but they don't know if everybody else reopens their restaurants,
right?
Is that a successful model for the post-pandemic world?
Right, because if you break that one down, just for a quick second, if you break that one down, isolate all the variables, what people are missing, like we still have access to restaurant food. Like that is not a problem. Most restaurants are doing carry out. So it's not for a lack of restaurant food. What people are craving is that experience of going to a restaurant. So when that's available again, I don't know how much takeout will happen.
Might not pay off. And the other things that are intangible are, what about people who, what they really crave? I mean, you and I talk about the intangibles of kind of these impromptu conversations or whatever. But what about people who are working their way up and really need that FaceTime with the boss?
Yes.
Or need the opportunities to show leadership, or need the opportunities to show value.
Or to learn through, it's not osmosis, because I think that's when you're sleeping. But I know there were a lot of things I learned growing up through the companies I was in just by hearing conversations, around me. And there's almost no opportunity for that, or to learn from other people in other departments, just because you hear conversations that aren't your thing. You're like, I didn't know that was. Oh, here's an interesting thing. I have found that this period is creating this really sharp contrast that helps. And the value of contrast is always that you see things you couldn't have noticed before because you have more of a distinction. And we put together a thank you video for my kids' teachers. The Parents Association did. And we had a bunch of kids, as many as we could. It's a small school, but about half to 3/4 of them did it. They just wrote thank you on something. They had some sort of thing that said thank you. And then the parents took a picture of them. So it's just like a picture of a bunch of the kids holding some sort of thank you sign or something.
Yeah.
And then I had a client of mine string them all together and with this, emotionally evocative music. And it's this thank you to the teachers because they've really jumped in and they've really knocked it out of the ballpark. So I've been inundated by the thank yous from the teachers. They're like, oh my gosh, this made me cry. This made me cry. At least 3 of them not only mentioned how much they loved seeing the kids that they don't teach, like the other kids in the school that they don't have in their class, because they're still getting to connect with the kids that are directly in their classes.
Sure.
But to a person, they also mentioned that they hadn't realized how much they missed seeing those other kids in the classroom. And so they were like, one of them said, I had no idea how much I missed seeing the rest of the kids in the school and passing them in the hallway and seeing how they're doing until I saw their faces and I couldn't stop crying. And what I love about that is I think any opportunity we have to name an otherwise just amorphous experience we're having, whether it's on the emotional side or whether it's an operational thing, to notice hey, here's where being together really has value. And actually, we don't have to do this the same way, or this is a possibility. Whenever you name it, there's a lot of value in that, because then you're like, oh, okay, that's a thing, or that's why that feels that way. And now I know to prioritize that and rather than just sort of choosing by random things that you don't know what you're choosing by.
No, it becomes a lot less scary, and you lose that, am I crazy? Because then you can kind of.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm making this up. None of them went into this great detail, but I could imagine, if I was that teacher being like, well, this is, I just must be like hormonal or depressed or whatever, not eating well, or because I'm seeing my kids. So why do I miss school? That's silly. Like I'm seeing the kids every single day, all day long. So I must be crazy, blah, 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 fill in the blank. And then to have something perk up like, oh, that's what that feeling was I was having. It's because I don't see the other kids.
And it's the same way at work. I'm seeing the people I work with, but I don't have that same sense of community with the people I work with.
And I don't have, like, I'm seeing my direct clients, but I definitely got some unnamed and previously unconscious value from, like, I go into their offices, some of them, not all of them. I go to their offices and I see people and say hi, and they're people I'm definitely not seeing now, but there's a little bit of just like that social connection that I think it was like drive-by social connection. It's not like I need to like call them and get on a Zoom call with them. That's way too much. We don't need that kind of connection. Yeah. But those little snippets of like, hey, how are you? Have some kind of value. I don't know what that is, but I'm noticing it.
Yeah. And those are the things that are really hard to schedule, particularly on a scattered, or a staggered background,
Right. Yep. Exactly.
So that's our story.
But the discussion doesn't have to end here.
No, it does not.
In fact, we don't want it to.
No, we don't.
That is why we actually have our private Facebook group,
which we started to make sure that we could get your comments, your rants, your thoughts,
your stories.
You
can find links to that group as well as show notes and links to subscribe via email and how to find us just about anywhere you can possibly find podcasts at sohere'smystory.com.
And you can also find us on Facebook and Twitter at SHMS Podcast.
And since we know it takes a village.
Yes, it does.
We'd like to thank our village, our super talented, incredibly patient team.
And occasionally snarky team.
Yeah, but in the best of ways.
In the best of ways.
Snarky.
Yes.
Good mockery.
So a huge shout out to the people who actually help us produce our show. First, our sound engineer, Tom Hansen.
Thanks to Christy Schmier for our brilliant show notes and all the other fantastic writing she does for us.
And to Taylor Mathauer for doing just a little bit of everything.
Including wrangling us.
Which
is no small feat.
No, it's not.
This is Jody Hume.
And I'm Elliot Wagenheim.
And you've been listening to So Here's My Story.